Okay, thank you everyone for joining our 30th Asia Business Conference. As the name suggests, this marks our 30th year anniversary. And for this year's conference, we'll be having more than 35 speakers, including but not limited to renowned companies such as BCG, Sony, Accenture, Citi, and the International Monetary Fund. We've been running the conference for 30 years, and it is the longest running student-led business conference in North America. Every year, we have more than 30 industry leaders participating and around 400 attendees. And a very special thanks to our sponsors, of course, the University of Michigan and the Ross School of Business, but also the departments including Mitsui Life Financial Research Center, Peyton Center, and also the Executive Education Center. And of course, this wouldn't have been possible without the continued interest of our audience and our wonderful team. So since you're here, you're probably all familiar with how to access the conference schedule and the link. But just a reminder, if you need to revisit, please go to abcross.org and look out for our emails. And also there will be recordings on social media. On the right, you will see our schedule for this year, adapting to the new normal. We'll be having our conference across 2 weeks, divided into 2 days. So this is week 1, day 1. After our keynote speech, we'll be having China panel. And for tomorrow morning, we'll be having 3 panels. And on week 2, which is next week, we'll be having 2 panels each day.
All right, and before we begin our keynote speech, we'd like to discuss some logistics. There will be a Q&A by our keynote speaker at the end of this session, which will be conducted through the Zoom Q&A function. And please use this function to ask your questions if you have any, and do not use the comments or the messaging or the chat function in Zoom. And now we'd like to begin the opener for our keynote speech. I'd like to introduce Dean Scott Daru, who will be opening for our keynote today. Scott Daru is the Edward J. Frey Dean of Stephen M. Ross School of Business here at the University of Michigan. He is also the Stephen M. Ross Professor of Business and has been named among the 50 most influential business professors in the world for his work on leadership, team performance, talent management, and organizational transformation, all of which have been frequently featured in the media. He also speaks and consults for organizations that span 5 continents, including Fortune 100 companies, startups, championship-winning sports teams, and government agencies. Earlier in his career, Dean Scott Daru worked in private equity and management consulting. And outside of academia, he is also an accomplished adventurer and mountaineer with successful summits of Mount Everest, Denali, Visin, as well as Aconcagua. For the past decade, the Dean has been given the opening speech for virtually all conferences organized by the ABC board. And for our 30th anniversary and first virtual conference, we're grateful and happy to invite Dean Scott Daru here again today.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill, very much, and Nick as well. From all of us in Ann Arbor to all of you around the world, thank you for joining. And best wishes to you, your families, your loved ones. I hope everyone is healthy and safe and continues to be. I want to begin by thanking Bill, Nick, and the entire student team who has organized our first ever virtual Asia Business Conference. I want all of you to know who's contributed to this program that I'm really proud of you and inspired by all of the work that you've put into this program. As Nick said, the Asia Business Conference, 30 years, this is the 30th anniversary, and has really become a hallmark of life at Michigan Ross and bringing people together. It's one of our most important events of the year. As Nick said, it's the longest running student-run conference in North America that's focused on business in Asia. For 30 years, this Asia Business Conference has brought together business leaders and government leaders and community leaders to the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business to discuss and debate and explore the issues that are defining not only the present, but also defining the future of business in Asia and around the world. And through a whole host of networking sessions and panel discussions, this annual event provides a wonderful opportunity for our attendees to connect, to forge relationships, and most importantly, to learn from each other. And this year's conference is no different, spread out over time, but with a wonderful lineup of speakers and panels and programs. I'm confident that all of you will have an amazing and enriching experience. I know for me personally, it's inspiring to see us coming together, looking to the future of business in Asia, but also business globally. A future where the East and West work together for shared prosperity. A future where the East and West can reimagine global business and relationships. And a future where our differences are celebrated and our similarities bring us together in unity to advance humankind forward and also to explore the frontiers of business in the years ahead. And it is in this spirit that I am deeply honored to introduce your keynote speaker to kick off this year's, the 30th anniversary of the Asia Business Conference. Subir Lall is Deputy Director in the Middle East and Central Asia Department of the International Monetary Fund. He's been the IMF Mission Chief for Egypt, Portugal, Germany, the Netherlands, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, and Deputy Chief of the World Economic Studies Division. His experiences have been global. His experiences have been throughout Asia, Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, across the Western Hemisphere. He's been the co-author of the IMF's World Economic Outlook and Global Financial Stability Report, really important thought leadership pieces. And his research interests are in the areas of financial systems, financial crises, market structures, income inequality, and to the topic of tonight's keynote address, or maybe this morning's keynote address, depending on where you are in the world, the impact of technological change on the economy. He has a BA with honors in economics from the University of Delhi and a PhD in economics from Brown University. Please join me in welcoming to Michigan Ross and the 30th Asia Business Conference, Mr. Lall. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean DeRue, for your very kind introduction. It's an honor to be introduced by a leading figure in the field of leadership and whose insights we have actually learned about in the classroom as part of the leadership training program here at the fund. So, you know, when a rock star in his field opens the event, it's going to be a tough act to follow. But I'll do my best, hopefully, to generate some debate and discussion and perhaps some questions as well ahead of this excellent program of panel discussions in this year's conference. It's really a great privilege to be able to join this conference. I'm especially delighted because this is a student-run conference, and that also includes business leaders from Asia and practitioners. Of course, the Asia focus is also of personal interest to me as I am from Asia, and I started my career in the Asian department in the IMF and have returned to the region again several times, and I travel there frequently. And I've had also the pleasure of visiting the University of Michigan several times, beginning as a student. And my closest friend and his spouse both are from graduates of Ross Business School. Of course, this year's event is virtual, but in a way maybe perhaps appropriate to the topic I want to talk about, which is how the world is changing and what it means for us today. In particular, today, I would like to present some thoughts about how the digital age is affecting macroeconomics, the future of work, and how younger people in particular need to think about the changes that are going on all over the world and moving across borders, literally at the speed of light. What I want to present is a framework through which we can think about the impact of technological changes and also business processes and the drivers of growth of businesses. I believe this framework is a useful way to try to look at these changes. I will also present some recent research as a way to show that the changes I will describe are real and sizable and are even having a macroeconomic impact. We will focus on inflation today. And that the framework I will propose is a useful way to understand these developments. This is part of a broader research program I have in this area for the next couple of years. I hope you will use this thought framework as you go to the panels in this conference, and indeed as you think about the future of Asia and your own futures. So starting with, I have a PowerPoint presentation, so we can perhaps move to that, starting with slide number 2, which is the theme of the conference. I am not able to see the presentation, so I'm not sure if it's up yet, but let me get started. So the theme of this year's conference is about technological innovations in an era of disruptions and how Asia will lead and shape the future of the world. I'm excited to note that you have a discussion with distinguished speakers on the future of financial industries in Asia, innovation in challenging times, connecting markets through data, finance and technology, virtual consulting, reforms and growth, and confronting challenges using technological solutions. There's a common thread that runs through these topics, and that I will also talk about. In fact, I would like to present a broad overview of what I think will be the dominant trend in coming decades, and where I believe Asia will be at the forefront. What I want to focus on is what challenges and opportunities it presents for students, business leaders, and young entrants to the workplace. I also hope it may provide you with some new insights you can discuss with the experts you'll be hearing from over the next days of this conference, this weekend and the next weekend. Slide 3, please. I'll keep this talk quite non-technical, given we have limited time, and the PowerPoint presentation itself and the references will have more technical details for those who might find that useful. So this is the outline of the presentation. I'll first quickly recap Asia's size and role in the global economy, and how the center of gravity of the global economy and the financial system continues to shift steadily towards Asia. And it's a process that has actually already been underway for quite some decades now, and it's expected to continue for another few decades at least. I will then describe the fourth industrial revolution and the changes it is bringing. You must have heard this term before. Asia is a leader along many of these dimensions, as we will see, and ahead of the game in some. This will be followed by a short discussion of why it is of interest to all of us to understand these changes and how to best take advantage of them. Many of the opportunities that arise from this transformation will be in Asia, which is large, dynamic, growing, and with a deep pool of talent and a big market and a strong tradition of entrepreneurship. I will offer the proposition that what is the critical feature of this fourth industrial revolution is something called intangible investment. The distinction from tangible investment is, I believe, critical in how we should think about the future and its possibilities. It is also critical to how we need to think macroeconomics, because it is fundamentally altering some long-cherished assumptions of economists. I will discuss briefly some work my co-author Li Zheng at the IMF and I have been doing on the question of persistently low inflation, to illustrate how these real changes seem to be and that they're not just futuristic speculations. We'll then come back to the bigger picture of what the implications are. And I'll argue that we are just at the beginning of these changes. And so the question is, what can the younger generation, employers, practitioners, and business managers do to take full advantage of this phenomenon? Next slide, please. So this chart is just a simple illustration of the growth rates of economies across regions of the world since the 1980s, and I'm sure you've seen it in some form. This uses the IMF's World Economic Outlook database, the vintage of October 2020. We had an update that came out just today, in fact, and you can find it on the IMF website, which slightly updates the numbers, especially the forecasts. But what you can see is that on average, it's the Asian Pacific region that has steadily grown faster than other regions. The two spikes you see are for the Middle East and are associated with spikes in oil prices, but otherwise it's Asia that has been the dynamic and fastest growing region for 4 decades now. The chart begins in 1980. Next slide, please. Because of this strong and steady growth, Asia's share of the global economy has also grown. In 1980, the Asian region was slightly over 20% or a fifth of the global economy, well behind the Western Hemisphere, which includes all of North America and South America, and the Europe regions, including Western and Eastern Europe. But now, Asia is about 36% of the global economy and larger than any other region, the way these are grouped. Next slide, please. A few other notable trends about Asia. Of the world's 20 largest publicly traded companies, as defined by Forbes, 12 are from the US and 7 are from Asia. Asia has almost 60% of the world's population at 4.6 billion. And it will likely be almost half of the global economy in just 2 more decades. It has a vibrant startup culture and intra-Asian investing between countries. And the region has some of the technologically most sophisticated companies and advanced manufacturing capability. And it has access to a vast pool of savings and highly educated talent and entrepreneurs. The fact that it is dynamic and growing, and it has this deep pool of talent, savings, and markets, and a tradition of innovation all bode well for the future. And I'll try to make the case for that based on what follows in this presentation. Next slide, please. So let's stop for a couple of minutes on industrial revolutions. They are defined as phases where how and what we produce changes very quickly and globally over time. And Klaus Schwab, who founded the World Economic Forum, has written extensively on this topic and on the current fourth industrial revolution. As a refresher, it's generally agreed that the first one was the use of steam and water power, and that gave us textile production, for example. The second one used electrical power and also telephones. The assembly line for cars is an example. The third industrial revolution used electronics and IT to automate production, and it's still ongoing and has been ongoing since the 60s. And in fact, that's how most factories now operate. But now we also have concurrently the fourth industrial revolution, which is generally associated with the information revolution, the internet, and the knowledge economy. I will discuss many examples of this as we go through the presentation. And Asia has certainly been very much part and parcel of the fourth industrial revolution. And many products and processes of this have been developed in the region. Next slide, please. So what's special about the fourth industrial revolution? It is marked by connectivity between people instantaneously through communications technology. For example, how we are doing this conference today. I'm here in Washington, DC. Some of you are in Michigan, some of you are elsewhere in the United States, and many of you are across the world, including on a Saturday morning in Asia. It's also connectivity between machines. This has been helped by a huge amount of processing power. The phone you had, the mobile phone, has vastly more computing power now than the computers that were used to put people on the moon on Apollo 13, for example. There's also the use of artificial intelligence. At the same time, it is not just about technology, it is also about processes and organizational models. Where once it was that large companies in a hierarchical structure, one sees now more decentralized business units, creative centers, less structure, because things are changing very fast. There are also much more synergies across products and integration across different sectors, and we'll discuss that in more detail in the next few minutes. And all these changes are all happening at a very high speed. Hence, that's why it's called disruption. Now, I have worked on Asia since the beginning of my fund career. And I recall from my very early travels how much more, for instance, even mobile phones and text messaging were adopted in Asia, in East Asia, even before here in Washington at that time, when I went to the Philippines, Singapore, and Korea, for example. Next slide, please. So why is it important to understand these changes? The question we asked ourselves was, are these changes not just about new products, but are they fundamentally changing the way we should think about economics, growth, inflation, inequality? And is this change, as it spreads through the corporate sector, also changing the structure and composition of the corporate sector? And of course, we should all care about what it does to inequality and to labor markets. What does this do to the lending model to finance businesses? And perhaps most importantly for everyone, what does it mean for the future of work? Next slide, please. So let me give some quick examples here about the fourth industrial revolution. You know, airlines is a good example. It's sort of a business that's been around for a long time, almost a century now. And in the first 80 years, airlines were generally money-losing ventures, and many of the airlines that existed have since gone out of business. In fact, you know, it used to be that if you wanted to be a millionaire in the airline business, you should start as a billionaire and just hold on long enough and you'll turn into a millionaire. But now they've become more efficient and consistently profitable. And what's happened? If you look at the load factor in airlines, that's changed. Planes have become more efficient, no doubt, but engines have improved. But it's also been that now airlines are able to fill every seat in every plane, and often the person sitting next to you is paying a completely different price from you. And it is the products of this fourth industrial revolution that have made it possible for airlines to fill all seats in all planes all the time. Similarly, automobiles, they used to be fairly mechanical, but now they're like mobile computers, and they're soon moving towards autonomous driving of different degrees. Now you need a computer just to diagnose the car when you take it into the shop. Ride-sharing businesses didn't exist until recent years. There were always cars, there were always drivers, there were also mobile phones, but somehow the magic of the fourth industrial revolution brought them all together. And then we know about bicycle exercise programs. They combine bikes with computers and with trainers, possibly in a different city, which has been, again, the synergy and bringing different processes and products together that I was talking about. Similarly, there are standardized gym training programs that are developed somewhere, and then they're made available to franchises worldwide. And that's also something different. You know, what I want to say, it's not all just about technology, it's also about processes and the availabilities of different, and the creation of different products and services. Next slide, please. What I would argue is that the common thread in all these things is the use of something called intangible investment. When we normally, as economists especially, think of investment, we think of plants and equipment, you know, brick and mortar things, machines. But intangible investment is non-physical investment, which also matters for production. And in fact, some of it is not even fully captured in GDP yet. So if you think about computers, the hardware is physical investment, but the software is non-physical investment. Another example is, for instance, branding and a brand identity, or developing processes, how to make the same high quality cup of coffee worldwide, market research. It's about knowledge in many ways. In many ways, what students do is intangible investment. Training programs, managerial and business processes. These are also non-physical, but they contribute to production. Databases, R&D, artistic originals, these are all intangible investments. Next slide, please. Now, before I discuss some of the trends, I wanted to highlight a few of the distinguishing features of intangible capital. And this follows a very excellent book by Haskell and Westlake, which was published a few years ago, called, I think, Capitalism Without Capital. And I highly recommend reading this book for a really good overview of the developments that have been taking place. There are some special characteristics about intangible investment. It can be scaled for little additional cost. I mean, software is, of course, a good example of that, but also business processes. It has something to do with its non-physical characteristics. It often has synergies. It requires a big investment upfront, and cannot be sold easily because it's very customized in many cases. As economists, we are trained to think in terms of allocation of limited resources. In fact, the whole of economics is built on that. But now along comes a form of capital, an input into the production process that seemingly can be reproduced very easily. That's what scalability means. That begins to challenge some of the very foundational assumptions about economics we learn in the classroom. It's almost like discovering that suddenly you have access to an unlimited factor of production once you've made the initial investment. Pretty exciting stuff. Next slide, please. But before we get too excited, we have to ask, is this for real? Is it meaningful as a trend? And is it big? And the answer is yes, yes, and yes. You can see from this chart, it'll be more clear. It's in the paper, one of the papers, the paper that's cited here with my colleague Li Zeng. You can see it's growing everywhere. And the trend is also pretty clear. And in fact, if you look closely in the United States and the United Kingdom, the amount of intangible investment already exceeds physical investment economy-wide. And so this is real and it's happening and it's a trend, and that'll be important for what we discuss over the next few minutes. Now, what inspired us, next slide, please, where this paper and this project began was actually a tweet by Bill Gates. And it's a chart he remembered from his Econ 10 class at Harvard. It's a simple supply and demand curve and equilibrium. That's basically where we start in economics, right? I mean, you have price and you have quantity. But he said, you know what, software doesn't work like this. And the portion of the world's economy that doesn't fit this model, like software, just keeps getting larger, which is a very astute observation. And then we try to think, okay, what does it mean for us as economists if this is really happening? First, is it happening? And if so, what does it mean? Next slide, please. So a short detour into economics. Since economics is all about supply and demand, we know that supply curves matter. And in the theory of the firms, the supply curve is upward sloping because the marginal costs rise the moment you try to produce more. You have to pay more for labor, you have to pay more for capital. And this is aggregated in traditional macro models to say that the economy's aggregate supply curve slopes upward as well. Our thinking was that if the intangible investment is more scalable and also if it is increasing as a share of the total investment, it must mean that a greater share of the factors of production in the economy are becoming scalable. This means that once an initial investment has been made, replicating it becomes cheaper. In traditional models, producing more makes it more costly, decreasing returns to scale, as we call it. What if marginal costs do not rise as fast, or indeed remain flat? What if decreasing returns to scale are not as pronounced as they used to be? Next slide, please. So we looked at the evidence and we investigated whether economy-wide supply curves were flattening, which is to say supply is becoming more elastic, that you can actually produce more in the short run without raising the costs. And we were able to get good comparable data, and there's an excellent database developed by Corrado and her colleagues, which has painstakingly put together the intangible investment data. And we find that the aggregate supply curve for the economy indeed seems to have flattened in many advanced economies, although at different rates. And that there is also a robust relationship between intangible capital in the economy, how much there is of that, and the slope of the supply curve. So this is real. Next slide, please. So this is just a chart where on the left, you see the United States, and on the right, you see Germany over two different time periods. And the time periods vary depending on the country. And you find that the flattening of the supply curve is statistically significant. And this is true for most countries, actually. The breakpoints vary, while some of them coincided with the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, where the trends changed. But for others, it happened at a different time. And this is consistent with what we'll discuss in the next couple of minutes, which is that the two major drivers of this flattening are globalization, of course, and that's, some people have talked about how globalization and global sourcing is changing business, but also the rising importance of intangible capital in production. Both of these are long-term structural changes, and they did not take place in all countries at the same time or even to the same degree. Now, the next slide, please, has this for a bunch of countries. It's a bit hard to see in the presentation, but you can see it in the PowerPoint later or in the paper itself. So I'll move quickly past this one. Next slide, please. Now, this is just for completeness. This is the regression analysis we did. I'm not going to go into that here, but just to show that what was sort of the regression structure that we used. Next slide, please. And these are the results. Again, this is just for completeness. I'm an economist. I need to put up regressions any chance I get. So here we are. But what this says is that basically, for a number of countries, we find this relationship does happen. that higher integration of the global economy and more intangible capital tends to make supply more elastic in countries. Now, there are some differences, and the gray ones are the ones where the results were not intuitive in individual economies. But next slide, please. When we do a cross-country analysis, we find extremely robust results, in fact. And these are very strong results, and that go in the direction that we were hoping to find, which is that higher integration of the global economy and larger shares of intangible capital mean more elastic supply. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for us? When an economy, why this is an illustration that this is a macroeconomic effect that is in fact happening. And I'll come back to what it means for us in the corporate or business environment. But just as a macro, this is to illustrate that it's happening. And why the slope of the supply curves matters is because it determines what the impact of a shock will be to an economy, as I'll show in a chart shortly, which is when an economy is hit by a shock like a recession, it leads to lower output, lower inflation, and higher unemployment. Now, the degree to which output is lower, inflation is lower, and unemployment is higher depends, in fact, exactly on the slope of the supply curve. So this is important for macroeconomic outcomes, including recessions and recoveries. Next slide, please. So if in fact the supply is becoming more elastic, then what happens is for the same shock, you might get a bigger loss of output and employment than you would have gotten in the past, but you'd also get a bigger recovery and bounce back. But at the same time, you might see smaller fluctuations in wages and prices. So from the outside, it might look like prices are becoming more sticky, and that's sort of the underpinning of many new Keynesian economics models. But in fact, what it could be is that prices are adjusting. They just need to adjust less to clear the market. So that also, of course, means that monetary and fiscal policies continue to be effective in restoring output and employment. Perhaps they're not as effective in restoring inflation. So it might cause us to rethink some of those things that when we look at the economy and look at policy responses, how do we interpret the data? That sometimes you find that unemployment is low, but wages and inflation are not rising. Does that mean that the policy has failed, or does it mean there's something deeper going on? That was what we were trying to do in this paper. Next slide, please. Here is a sort of a characterization in a chart form. Basically what I just talked about, but in a more of a graphical form, that what happens is when the slope changes is you arrive at an equilibrium, which you see on the right-hand side, where the equilibrium price is lower than it used to be. But in fact, you reached full employment. That's the Y star all over again. Next slide, please. So what are the implications and why is this important? So if we agree that intangible capital is rising in all countries, and in fact it has overtaken the amount of tangible investment, intangible investment I mean, has overtaken in countries, that means the trend is real. We've tried to show that in fact it's already having a macroeconomic impact. That's our sort of hypothesis. What that means is that the rewards to skills that create intangible capital or that can apply it creatively will be high and keep rising and will create more opportunities for the next few decades. On the other hand, skills that can be substituted by intangible or physical capital for that matter, or the products they produce will eventually be replaced over time. For physical capital, of course, we know, like once automobiles were created, they got rid of the horse-drawn carriage. But now what we can see is that even intangible capital may be able to substitute away some of the other skills, some of the other abilities that human beings bring. That being said, what makes us human will remain human, and things such as creativity, emotional intelligence, the power of imagination and invention, art, music, they will remain the same. In that context, I would encourage you also to take a look at Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, his book, Hit Reset, which is about, again, what technology can do and what it will not be able to do. And the question is how best to capitalize on these changes. They will, I do believe, increase human potential. They will not limit it. Next slide, please. this change is inevitable, include more sectors and industries. For example, in medicine now, machines can do a lot of the reading of X-rays, but you still need the doctor to sift through all that, to look at the recommendation. They will not do a diagnosis based on just what a computer spits out, right? You still need that, but it makes the doctor's job many ways easier by categorizing and classifying, instead of comparing it with 10 other X-rays, to be able to compare it with 10,000 other X-rays to get a much more precise diagnosis. The same is true in the legal profession. These are, very traditional professions in many ways, but, instead of having a paralegal who goes through and compares case documents, say from, even 100 cases, you can have a computer and machine learning do that for tens of thousands of cases and then help the legal profession build arguments on the basis of that. So you can see how the intangible component comes in and can complement the human skills. So what I would argue is this is not to be feared. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity for many of us. And in many ways, some of this, as you see, requires much less financial capital than earlier ones. It requires ingenuity, it requires imagination. So it's potentially accessible to all of us. Unlike in the old days, if you wanted to set up a factory, say in the 1920s or 30s, you had to have very deep pockets and go to bankers, make your business case, and then set up a factory. Now, in many ways, it's much more accessible. It's accessible worldwide. And in a way, as Dean DeRue was saying earlier, it's also, I believe this is a way for the world to get connected with each other and work together towards a common purpose. And entrepreneurship can go across borders. It can create new engines and drivers of growth and job creation. And people can work together across the world, and the best ideas and best collaborators, you don't have to be even physically in the same place. So those who can create intangible capital or apply it can stand to benefit. And this is not limited to the tech sector. I gave some examples of traditional sectors, but which are able to use some of this new development. Finally, it also means the approach to learning has to focus on developing skills for creative problem solving, for connecting dots and innovation, for thinking outside the box, things that machines cannot do. It used to be that, this is the last slide, that, a lot of it, learning was memorization, but now your mobile phone can probably hold a lot more facts and factoids than you can ever store in your mind. So that's not where the future lies. The future lies in what you make of those things. So this brings me to the end of my talk, and just wanted to leave you with the thought that, what's happening is a long-term trend. It's shifting. There will be a reward for certain kinds of human skills. You will see the patterns of this in the panels you have for the rest of this conference. There will be an element of this, I think, discussed in all the panels, including, for instance, the one on consulting or the one on the financial sector and on technological solutions to problem solving and so on. So I hope this gives you a little bit of a framework through which I and myself and my co-author Lee, for example, look at how the world is changing to make sense of it and where the opportunities lie. Let me stop here, and then, of course, happy to also take any questions. Back to you, Dean DeRue.
All right, so we're gonna open it up for Q&A oh, first of all, thank you, Dr. Lall, for this great speech, which is especially relevant for Asia specifically as well, given the transformation that it's going through along with the world. And we'd like to open it up for Q&A. And so we'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom as usual. And Dr. Lall can be answering the questions from there.
Great, thanks.
Right.
Okay, so we have one question. Let me perhaps get started. And this is, how has the work at the IMF, my work at the IMF, perhaps affected my view of Asian business and examples of projects that have engaged in. So maybe I can give you a little bit of background on what the IMF does. So the International Monetary Fund, of course, is, as you know, a global institution where with almost universal membership, almost all the countries in the world, 190, are shareholders of the institution. And the IMF does three things. So one is what is called surveillance of member countries, which is we have an annual health check of all the economies of the world, and we present the findings of this annual health check to our executive board, which represents all countries, and that gives an opportunity for all countries, and this is part of the post-World War II cooperative system, the Bretton Woods system, for countries to learn from each other, advise each other on good policies, and with the overall objective of preserving international monetary and financial stability. Now, you might recall that the reason this was set up in this way was because a lot of the genesis of World War II, in particular, was due to economic imbalances and protectionism and economic competition. And so the Bretton Woods institution, the IMF and the World Bank were set up to encourage cooperation with countries and to prevent that sort of disorderly economic warfare between countries in a way. The second thing, of course, that the IMF does is provide lending to countries that are facing economic hardships and are unable to access capital markets to borrow for governments. And so, for instance, with the COVID-19 crisis, the IMF's lending has expanded greatly to countries to provide financing to be able to overcome some of the challenges posed by the pandemic. The IMF does not actually do project lending. And so that's more the World Bank's area. And ours is, the institution's lending is more related to what's called balance of payments needs and lending to ensure that a country's external accounts are viable and they're able to service their debt. And the third part is capacity building, because to function effectively as an economy, it's not just about policies, but also strong institutions. So the capacity building of the IMF is meant to ensure that, for instance, how to build good tax systems, how to build good revenue collection, how to organize a good spending plan, sort of the plumbing of economic policy making. That's the third element of the IMF's work. Now, I see there's another question, which is how has the pandemic affected the trajectory of business in Asia, and has it accelerated or affected the transition on artificial intelligence in any way? That's, since we're still in a way in the pandemic, it's really hard to speak very definitively about how things will shape up afterwards. But I would say a couple of things. One is what I think the pandemic in many ways has brought the future much closer, much more quickly in terms of trends that were already happening, including, for instance, remote work or virtual conferences and the like. So it's not clear that the trajectory has changed, but the pace may have changed, because things like social distancing and lockdowns made some things absolutely necessary. And now artificial intelligence, as the question was, it seems is a very narrow element of this whole fourth industrial revolution, but an important one. But again, the way I see it is that has in many ways been deployed. And so, as I say, in general, it's really hard to right now say how much there will be a permanent change in things, because when things normalize, we might also start going back to the offices, to universities, classrooms, and so it's hard to prognosticate on how that'll happen. But what I think has happened, and which I think is a good thing, is that the fear or the hesitation to do technological adoption has perhaps been reduced. And then people have realized that this can be a force for tremendous good going forward. And then, so a couple of other questions here. Are there questions that have other industries that have benefited, especially from Asia's economic development, and then industries that have been harmed? Now, look, over time, industries, have their heyday and go on, because that is the very definition of technological change. And what it means that what used to be thriving sectors then over time become less important. For example, I see that with the global awareness of climate change, there'll be a lot of climate-related initiatives that will help certain sectors and industries, renewables, for example. And it is. The thing is, it's very difficult again to predict which sectors will thrive and which ones will win or lose. But what you would try to look for is patterns, and what you would try to look for is readiness. So more flexible economies, those that can reallocate resources more quickly from declining to growing sectors and shift labor, and employment to those sectors, tend to be the more successful ones. Whereas those who get locked into a sector and into a rigid structure are less able to shift as quickly when circumstances change. And that, of course, requires a lot of policies, including, a social protection system, unemployment insurance, a good healthcare system, all the things that would make it easier for people to move across sectors and across industries. So similarly here in this presentation, what I tried to do was talk about, for instance, intangible investment, which I think is at the core of the fourth industrial revolution. That is a trend that will remain. And when you think about the changes, you can put it in that framework and try to analyze, is this for real or not? And what does it mean? That doesn't mean that the framework will tell you, okay, this is the sector that's going to do well, or this is the sector that's going to do not so well. But at least when you see things happening, you can make that judgment for yourself. One example, I would say, if one went down very much to the micro level, as say, if you're thinking as an entrepreneur, it is not enough, to think, okay, I can go into this sector and I'll become very successful in that. For instance, if your cost structure, what I've tried to say is what's special about intangible investment is the cost advantages it can give, because the more you scale, and it doesn't cost you more. So, scale is your friend. But if you get into a sector where scalability is not ensured, that means there are new entrants who can come in and who can compete with you, then there are less advantages even to being, the pioneer or the first mover. Whereas if you're in a sector where scale is your friend, being the first mover can create opportunities, because you can share the benefits of your lower cost structure with your customers. And then the customers can benefit from that, and so can you, and so you can build a viable business. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you should create a monopoly and not deter competition. That's more of a securities and regulation question. But what it means is there's some viability that can happen in those sectors. Again, I'm not economists. I'm not I don't want to be too much of a futurologist, and we are notoriously bad at predicting the future as economists. I think we make weather predictions look really, really good. So I think there's a question on the movement of supply chains and whether this trend will continue and how this trend might affect global development. Look, I think the way we need to think about supply chains, for instance, and the answer to global prosperity and global well-being is more integration, and rather in not turning inwards and not closing borders. The great prosperity that happened over the past decades since World War II, in fact, and certainly for Asia, what lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty was integration with the global economy. In fact, that's been the most successful poverty reduction program in human history. And so I think now the question is how to build robust supply chains and integration, but clearly the solution is not to break away from that or to look inwards at all. And in fact, global integration is something that benefits all. And so I expect that and hope that that's what the future will also look like. And now in terms of there's a question in general about I would say economic competition between countries. Now the role of the fund, as I explained, is also to provide a multilateral forum where countries sit and discuss their economic policies and promote understanding and learn from each other. So that's kind of the role the IMF plays in fostering greater international cooperation, because we live in a world where the borders are becoming more porous because of technological change, what we talked about today, for example, and because of trade and integration. And so there are multilateral solutions to many problems. In fact, you're seeing it even right now with COVID, when the vaccines, they're developed, but they need to be made available worldwide, and countries need to cooperate. So those are multilateralism. I'm certainly a big believer in that, and I think that's the kind of role that the IMF plays, is bringing everybody together to find solutions that are for the common good and benefit everybody. I see one more question, and which is on does automation increase the value of human labor as craftsmanship? Does intangibility increase the value of tangible things? Automation does increase what the return to the things that machines cannot do, and that's important. And so it's as I mentioned in the discussion, the creative inputs. How to use the automation, but to use it in a way to produce things of greater value and of greater need, is where the future is. And so that's, I think, that they come together. But since most tangible products can be automated, the human capital and our investment has, the future is in things that cannot be automated easily, but in fact can work with those skills to produce more valuable things and help create jobs and improve living standards for everybody. So that's, I think, all the questions we have so far. So since we should be wrapping up in a few minutes, maybe I'll make a couple of other points, which is what I wanted to underscore was that we are really, I think, at the early stages of this transformation. This is really, well, I tried to show to you using some data, this is happening, this is real. But also it's going to fundamentally change even, what we think of as, traditional businesses and sectors. And if you can be among those who look at a traditional sector and think, how can I make it better? How can I bring to bear my creativity and innovation and, invest my either intangible capital or bring somebody else's develop intangible capital to make this product better? You can transform sectors. You can create whole new areas of growth and employment. And And so that's in a way where the future is. And at the same time as we do that, we have to think and be mindful that change also affects adversely people who don't necessarily have the right skills mix or the right abilities. And it is important for all of us as global citizens and as policymakers to be mindful of the impact that these structural transformations have, and to make sure through policies that everybody can benefit from these transitions into a new post in this industrial revolution structure of the economy, and that no one, no country, or no group of people within a country get left behind because of this. But as long as that is done, this is all good news. The transformations that are happening, they increase human potential. They don't limit it. They increase the possibility of higher standards of living. But that also means that policies need to make sure that everybody is carried along and gets to share in the prosperity that results from this. So let me stop here. I think we are pretty much out of time. I would like to thank all the Dean Deru, of course, and all the organizers of this conference. And it's been a real honor for me to be here. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference and all the very interesting panel discussions that follow, both this evening and in coming days. Thank you again, and stay well and be safe.
Thank you.
Yeah, once again,
so
thank you so much, Dr. Lall. I hope this was an enlightening experience for all the audience and the attendees.
And in terms of next step, of course, I think we all know that we have a China panel that is going to begin right after this at 8:10 p.m. Eastern time. And I will put the link to the panel in the chat here in Zoom if anyone's interested in joining. And once again, thank you so much, Dr. Lall, for the especially relevant speech and very interesting and awesome speech about technology and macroeconomics. That is especially, again, relevant for Asia. That is one of the regions, I guess, that is in the forefront of this change. And so
thank you.
Thank you. All right. And I think we're going to start moving to the China panel if we are still in the conference. And thank you again for attending this keynote speech, and see you guys there.